People like you don't walk in here with money, Daniel Whitmore said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the bank lobby. And for a moment, even the soft clicking of keyboards behind the counters seemed to pause as Marcus Reed stood across from him, still as a statue. The faint scent of polished marble and fresh coffee hanging in the air between them, while the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows and painted long, pale streaks across the floor, catching the edge of the check in Marcus's hand as if it were something fragile, something about to disappear. Marcus didn't move right away, his fingers steady, his posture calm, his expression unreadable in a way that made it impossible to tell whether he had heard the insult or simply chosen not to respond to it. And that silence, thick, deliberate, almost heavy, settled over the room more forcefully than any raised voice could have as a few customers waiting in line shifted their weight, exchanging quick glances that carried quiet judgment, curiosity, or something closer to discomfort. Daniel, standing behind the polished counter in his tailored gray suit, exhaled through his nose as if already tired of the interaction, his eyes flicking briefly to the worn edges of Marcus's coat, the scuffed shoes, the details he believed told him everything he needed to know. And with a practiced motion that felt less like a decision and more like a habit, he reached forward and took the check without asking another question, barely giving it more than a glance before his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "This isn't going to clear," he added, almost casually, as though he were doing Marcus a favor by stating the obvious. And then, without waiting for a reply, he turned slightly, the overhead light catching the corner of a small metal tray near his station, the faint reflection of movement flickering across its surface as he struck a lighter, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet space. For a split second, the flame hovered there, small but bright, dancing at the tip like a decision that could still be undone, but Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't reconsider, and as he brought the edge of the check closer, the paper curled almost instantly, darkening, the faint crackle of burning fibers threading into the silence while a thin ribbon of smoke twisted upward into the air, slow and deliberate, as if even it understood the weight of what was happening. Marcus watched it all without stepping back, without raising his voice, his eyes following the movement of the flame, the way the ink blurred and vanished, the way something tangible turned to nothing in a matter of seconds. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, not because of the act itself, but because of the stillness of the man it was done to, because there was no anger in his face, no panic, no desperation, only a quiet, almost unsettling composure that didn't match the situation at all. Behind Daniel, a young teller hesitated, her hands frozen over the keyboard as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. While near the door, a security guard shifted slightly, uncertain whether to step forward or stay where he was, caught between protocol and instinct. The last corner of the check crumbled into ash, falling in soft gray flakes onto the polished surface below, and Daniel flicked the lighter closed with a small, final click, brushing his fingers together as if to rid them of something insignificant before looking back up at Marcus with a gaze that expected resistance, argument, maybe even pleading, but none came, and that absence, that refusal to react the way he anticipated, lingered in the air like the faint smell of smoke, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Marcus Reed did not look at Daniel when the last trace of ash settled against the polished counter. His gaze lowered just slightly, as if he were studying something only he could see, something far beyond the gray dust that had once been paper, and for a long second he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because the silence itself carried more weight than any immediate response could. The kind of silence that made people shift uncomfortably in their place without fully understanding why. Somewhere behind him, a printer hummed. Back to life, the faint mechanical sound cutting through the stillness in a way that felt almost intrusive, and the teller who had hesitated moments earlier finally looked down at her screen again. Though her fingers hovered uncertainly above the keys, as if she had forgotten what she had been doing before all of this began, Marcus slowly lifted his head, his eyes moving not to Daniel, but to the wide glass windows at the front of the building where the city moved on, as it always did, cars passing by in steady lines, people walking with purpose along the sidewalk, unaware of the quiet fracture that had just occurred inside this space. And there was something in that contrast that settled deep in his chest, something familiar, something old. He took a breath, not sharp or forced, just steady, measured, the kind of breath a person takes when they have learned over time that reacting too quickly can cost more than silence ever will. And then he finally spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard without demanding attention. "Do you always decide before you verify?" he asked, the words landing softly but with a clarity that seemed to ripple outward, drawing the attention of those who had tried to look away back into the moment whether they intended to or not. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of reaction that might have gone unnoticed if not for the stillness surrounding it. And he let out a short breath that sounded closer to impatience than consideration, his fingers tapping once against the counter as if to reassert control over the interaction. "I have been doing this long enough to know what I am looking at," he replied, his tone measured but edged with a certainty that felt practiced rather than earned. And yet, even as he spoke, there was a flicker, brief and subtle, that passed through his expression, something that suggested the question had landed deeper than he expected. Marcus nodded once, a small motion, almost respectful in its simplicity, as if he were acknowledging not the correctness of the statement, but the fact that it had been made at all, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat with unhurried precision, the movement slow enough that it did not trigger alarm, but deliberate enough that it drew attention. And when his hand emerged, it held nothing dramatic, no sudden reveal, just a simple, worn leather wallet that he placed gently on the counter where the ashes still lingered. The contrast between the clean lines of the object and the scattered gray remnants beneath it creating a quiet visual tension that no one commented on, but everyone seemed to notice. He opened it without rush, his fingers steady, revealing a card tucked neatly inside. Though he did not slide it forward yet, did not present it like evidence or argument, instead letting it rest there, visible but unclaimed, as if giving the moment time to catch up with itself. And in that pause, the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as though something just beneath the surface was beginning to move. The young teller glanced up once more, her eyes flicking between Marcus and the card, then to Daniel, waiting for a cue that did not come. While near the entrance, the security guard straightened slightly, not stepping forward, but no longer relaxed either, caught in that uncertain space between routine and recognition. Marcus's gaze finally returned to Daniel, steady, unchallenging, but unwavering, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "There was a time," he said, "when I stood outside a place like this and was told I did not belong inside." And though the sentence was simple, it carried with it the weight of years, of doors closed without explanation, of decisions made without verification. And for the first time since the encounter began, Daniel did not respond immediately. The practiced rhythm of his authority disrupted just enough to create a pause that felt unfamiliar, as if the moment itself were asking a question he was not prepared to answer. Daniel Whitmore did not immediately reach for the card, his eyes fixed on it, as though it might change shape if he stared long enough. And for the first time since the interaction began, the confidence in his posture seemed to hesitate, not collapse, not disappear, but shift just enough to create a subtle imbalance that those watching could feel even if they could not name it. The faint scent of burned paper still lingered in the air, mixing now with something quieter, less tangible, the kind of tension that builds when certainty begins to crack. And behind the counter, the young teller swallowed softly, her gaze drawn again to the wallet, then to Marcus, as if trying to reconcile the calm presence in front of her with the assumptions that had filled the room only moments earlier. Daniel finally moved, but not with the same sharp decisiveness as before, his hand lifting toward the card with a slower, more measured motion, his fingers pausing just a fraction before making contact. And when he slid it free, the small plastic surface caught the overhead light, reflecting a brief, clean flash that seemed almost too bright against the muted tones of the lobby. He glanced down, expecting confirmation of what he already believed, something routine, something dismissible, but as his eyes scanned the printed name, the embossed details, the quiet authority carried in its design, something in his expression tightened, not dramatically, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to break the smooth rhythm he had maintained until now. Marcus did not speak, did not rush to explain, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his shoulders relaxed, as if he had already said everything that needed to be said and was simply allowing the truth to arrive in its own time. A soft murmur moved through the line behind him, barely audible, the kind of sound people make when they sense a shift but are not yet sure what it means. And near the entrance, the security guard straightened a little more, his attention no longer divided, his focus narrowing on the quiet exchange unfolding at the counter. Daniel cleared his throat, a small, almost involuntary sound, and looked up from the card to Marcus, searching for something in his face. A hint of uncertainty, a crack he could use to regain control of the situation, but there was none, only that same steady composure that now felt less like passivity and more like intention. "This does not change the process," Daniel said, though his voice lacked the edge it had carried before, the words landing with less certainty than he intended, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. And he placed the card back down, not dismissively, but carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter in a gesture that felt more controlled than confident. Marcus's eyes followed the movement briefly, then returned to Daniel, and when he spoke again, his tone remained even, almost quiet, but there was a depth to it now, something that carried beyond the immediate moment. "Process matters," he said, "but so does the way you decide who deserves it." And the sentence settled into the space between them, not confrontational, not raised, but undeniable in its presence. The teller behind Daniel shifted again, her chair creaking softly against the floor, and this time she did not look back down at her screen, her attention fully drawn into the moment, while another employee further down the counter leaned slightly, pretending to organize papers but clearly listening. Daniel's grip on the edge of the counter tightened just enough for his knuckles to pale, a small detail, easy to miss, but telling in its restraint, and for a brief second, his gaze flicked toward the office hallway behind him, as if considering something beyond the immediate interaction, something procedural, something that might restore the familiar structure he relied on. But the room had already shifted, the quiet hierarchy of assumptions disrupted. And as the seconds stretched, the absence of a quick resolution began to feel louder than any raised voice could have been. The weight of the moment pressing in not through action, but through the growing realization that the situation was no longer as simple as it had first appeared. Daniel Whitmore straightened slightly, as if pulling himself back into the version of authority he was more comfortable wearing, his shoulders squaring, his chin lifting just enough to signal control even as the room around him no longer fully responded to it. And he reached for the keyboard in front of him with a deliberate motion, the soft clack of keys breaking the silence in a way that felt almost forced, almost performative, as though the act of typing itself could restore order to a situation that had begun to slip beyond routine. "We can run a verification," he said, his tone measured, professional, but now carefully neutral, stripped of the earlier edge that had carried judgment, and the words sounded less like a dismissal and more like a concession, though he did not frame it that way, did not acknowledge the shift directly, instead focusing on the screen as lines of data populated in front of him, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes as he navigated through the system with practiced familiarity. Marcus remained still, his hands resting lightly against the counter, his posture unchanged, but there was something in the quiet patience he held that made the moment feel less like compliance and more like observation, as if he were not waiting for validation, but allowing the process to reveal itself. Behind Daniel, the young teller leaned slightly forward, unable to fully mask her curiosity. Now, her gaze flicking between the monitor and Marcus, her earlier hesitation replaced by a growing awareness that something important was unfolding, something that extended beyond a single transaction. Daniel's fingers paused briefly over the keyboard, his brow tightening as he read through the account details, and for a moment, the confidence in his movements slowed, just enough to suggest that what he was seeing did not align with what he had expected, though he quickly resumed typing, clicking through additional layers of verification as if searching for confirmation that would return the situation to something familiar. The low hum of the bank's system seemed louder now, filling the space between breaths, between glances, while near the entrance, the security guard shifted his stance again, no longer anticipating conflict, but clearly aware that the dynamic had changed in a way he did not yet understand. There must be a mistake, Daniel muttered under his breath, not loud enough to address anyone directly, but audible enough to break the quiet, and he leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the information with increasing focus, the small details beginning to accumulate in a way that resisted dismissal. Account balances, linked entities, authorization levels, each piece fitting together with a precision that left less and less room for doubt. Marcus's gaze moved briefly to the monitor, not to read, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge the direction the moment was taking, and then back to Daniel, steady as before, unhurried, unreactive, as though he had already seen this realization unfold many times in many different forms. The teller inhaled softly, her eyes widening just slightly as she caught a glimpse of the data reflected on the edge of the screen, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to recognition. Though she said nothing, her training holding her in place even as her instincts urged her to respond. Daniel's hand tightened around the mouse, the subtle tension visible now in the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders no longer sat as easily as they had at the beginning of the interaction, and he clicked into another window, another confirmation layer, as if the repetition itself might produce a different outcome. But the information remained consistent, unchanging, quietly definitive. The seconds stretched, not long in any measurable sense, but heavy in their accumulation, each one adding to the growing weight of what was becoming impossible to ignore. And finally, Daniel leaned back, just slightly, the movement small but significant, as if creating distance between himself and the screen might somehow soften the clarity of what it displayed. He glanced once more at Marcus, not with the earlier certainty, not even with irritation, but with something more uncertain, something searching, and though he did not speak immediately, the silence that followed carried a different quality now, no longer controlled, no longer imposed, but shared, shaped by the quiet realization that the process he had relied on to define the situation was now revealing something he had not anticipated, something that could not be dismissed with a glance or reduced to an assumption. And for the first time since the moment began, the balance between them had begun to shift in a way that no one in the room could ignore. The quiet hum of the system seemed to grow louder as Daniel Whitmore stared at the screen, his eyes no longer scanning but fixed, as if the numbers had stopped being data and had become something else entirely, something personal, and his hand, still resting on the mouse, did not move for a moment longer than it should have. The pause stretching just enough for those watching to sense that whatever he was seeing had crossed a line from routine into something undeniable. Behind him, the young teller leaned forward just slightly, her breath held without realizing it, her gaze catching fragments of the information reflected faintly on the glass divider. And though she could not see everything, what little she could piece together was enough to shift her expression from curiosity into quiet shock. Daniel finally blinked, a small, almost delayed reaction, and straightened in his chair. But the movement lacked its earlier precision, as if his body was catching up to a realization his mind had not yet fully processed, and when he reached for the keyboard again, his fingers hovered above it without pressing a key, suspended in hesitation. This account, he began, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty, but he did not finish the sentence, the words dissolving before they could form into something complete, and instead he cleared his throat softly, attempting to reset the moment, to reclaim a sense of structure that was slipping further with each passing second. Marcus did not interrupt, did not lean forward, did not claim the space that was quietly opening around him. He simply remained where he was, his presence steady, his gaze calm, as though he had already accepted the outcome long before it revealed itself to anyone else. The air in the lobby felt different now, heavier in a quieter way, not tense with conflict, but weighted with recognition. And the customers waiting in line had stopped pretending not to watch, their attention drawn fully into the exchange, subtle shifts in posture and expression reflecting a shared awareness that something significant was unfolding. Daniel clicked into another tab, then another, his movements more deliberate now, less about speed and more about certainty, as if he needed to confirm the same truth from multiple angles before allowing himself to accept it, and each screen returned the same result, the same name. The same layered structure of authority that extended far beyond a single account, linking entities, holdings, and approvals in a pattern that left no room for misinterpretation. A faint sound escaped him. Not quite a word, not quite a breath, something in between, and he leaned back slightly, the chair shifting under his weight with a soft creak that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. The teller behind him swallowed again, her hands now resting flat against the desk, no longer pretending to work, her attention fully fixed on Daniel, as if waiting for him to say something that would explain what she was beginning to understand on her own. Marcus's eyes moved briefly across the room, not searching, not claiming, simply observing, taking in the subtle change in how people looked at him now, the shift from dismissal to uncertainty, from assumption to quiet attention, and there was no satisfaction in his expression, no trace of triumph, only a calm acceptance of something that felt less like a victory and more like a familiar pattern repeating itself in a different setting. Daniel finally turned his head toward Marcus, slowly, deliberately, as though the movement itself required effort, and for the first time, there was no attempt to mask what was in his eyes, no practiced layer of authority or control, only a flicker of realization that had not yet settled into words. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with everything that had not been said earlier, every assumption, every dismissal, every quiet judgment now standing in contrast to the reality unfolding in front of him. And as the seconds stretched, it became clear to everyone in the room that the moment had moved beyond a simple transaction, beyond a misunderstanding, into something far more revealing, something that could not be undone or ignored, only acknowledged, whether Daniel was ready to do so or not. The silence did not break right away, it deepened, settling into the space like a weight that no one dared to disturb. And for the first time since Marcus Reed had walked into the bank, the room felt smaller, not in size, but in certainty, as if the polished marble floors and tall glass walls could no longer hold the assumptions that had filled them just minutes earlier. Daniel Whitmore remained still behind the counter, his gaze drifting back to the screen, then to the card, then finally to Marcus again, each glance slower than the last, as though he were trying to align three different realities that refused to match. And when he exhaled, it was quieter than before, less controlled, the kind of breath that escapes when something internal begins to shift. Marcus did not rush the moment. He did not lean forward or reclaim the space that was quietly returning to him. Instead, he stood with the same composed stillness, his eyes lowering briefly to the faint gray traces of ash still scattered across the counter, the remnants of something that had been dismissed too quickly. And there was something in that image that seemed to anchor the entire room, a visual reminder of how easily something real could be reduced to nothing when judgment moved faster than understanding. A soft sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, a door closing, distant footsteps, ordinary movements that felt strangely amplified against the stillness at the front of the lobby. And the young teller behind Daniel shifted her weight again, her hands now resting in her lap, her attention no longer divided, her expression no longer uncertain, but quietly aware. Daniel finally spoke, though his voice lacked the firmness it once carried. "There are protocols," he said, the words slower, more deliberate, as if he were choosing them carefully, not to assert control, but to hold on to something familiar, something structured. And yet, even as he said it, the sentence felt incomplete, like a statement without a foundation, because the process he relied on had already begun to reveal more than he intended it to. Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of the effort behind the words, and his gaze lifted again, meeting Daniel's without challenge, without accusation, just presence, steady and unshaken. The air between them felt different now, no longer charged with dismissal or resistance, but suspended, waiting, as if the moment itself had slowed down to allow something deeper to surface. Marcus's voice, when it came, was softer than before, almost reflective. "I learned a long time ago," he said, his tone even, measured, "that people rarely see what is in front of them. They see what they expect to see." And the words settled into the space gently, without force, but with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. Daniel's eyes shifted slightly, the sentence landing somewhere beneath the surface, not immediately processed, but felt. and he glanced down again at the card, at the screen, at the small details that had begun to contradict his first impression, and for a brief second, his reflection in the monitor caught his attention. The image of himself framed by data that no longer supported his assumptions, and there was something in that reflection that held him there longer than expected. The customers in line remained quiet, their earlier restlessness replaced by a still attention, as though they were witnessing something more than a disagreement, something that reached beyond the counter, beyond the bank itself, into a pattern they recognized but rarely saw so clearly. Marcus's gaze drifted once more toward the windows, the late afternoon light shifting slightly, casting longer shadows across the floor, and in that quiet transition, the moment seemed to breathe, to expand just enough to hold everything that had happened and everything that was about to be understood. Daniel's fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the counter, then relaxed, the motion subtle but telling, and when he finally looked up again, there was a hesitation in his expression that had not been there before, not uncertainty exactly, but the beginning of recognition, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but unfolds slowly, piece by piece, until it can no longer be denied. And in that stillness, with no raised voices and no sudden movements, the entire room seemed to feel it at the same time, the quiet turning point where assumption gives way to truth, and nothing needs to be said for it to be understood. The moment did not explode. It unfolded, quiet and precise, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for its turn. And it came not from Marcus Reed, not from Daniel Whitmore, but from a small, sharp sound that cut through the stillness with unexpected clarity, the ring of a desk phone behind the counter, insistent but controlled, the kind of call that did not wait long to be answered. Daniel's eyes shifted toward it immediately, instinct taking over where certainty had failed, and he reached for the receiver with a hand that was steady by effort rather than ease, lifting it to his ear as the room seemed to lean into the silence around him. "Whitmore," he said, his voice measured, though softer than before, and for a brief second, nothing changed, the rhythm of the moment holding its breath until the voice on the other end spoke, too low for anyone else to hear, but strong enough to alter everything. Daniel's expression shifted in increments, small at first, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, a slight pause in his breathing, and then something deeper, something unmistakable, the kind of realization that does not arrive as a shock, but as a confirmation of what has already begun to form. "Yes," he said quietly, his gaze flicking once toward Marcus, then back to the counter. "He is here." And the words, though simple, carried a weight that rippled outward, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot, even those who could not hear the voice on the other end. The young teller straightened in her chair, her eyes widening just slightly, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with something closer to understanding, while the security guard near the entrance shifted his stance again, no longer uncertain, but alert in a different way, as if recognizing that the situation had moved beyond his role entirely. Daniel listened, his posture gradually changing, the subtle tension in his shoulders giving way to something else, something more restrained, more aware, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. "I understand," he said, each word deliberate, chosen, as if he were stepping carefully through a space that no longer belonged to him alone. There was a pause, longer this time, and then, quietly, "Yes, sir." The final word landing with a clarity that did not need to be explained. He lowered the receiver slowly, placing it back onto its cradle with a controlled motion that seemed to carry more weight than the action itself required. And for a moment, he did not move, his eyes fixed on the surface of the counter, on the faint traces of ash, on the wallet still resting where Marcus had placed it. The room remained silent, not out of uncertainty now, but out of recognition. The shift complete even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. And Daniel finally looked up, his gaze meeting Marcus's without the barrier of assumption that had defined it before, and in that look, there was no longer dismissal, no longer irritation, but something quieter, something more exposed. Marcus did not change his posture, did not step forward or claim the space that had opened around him. He simply stood as he had from the beginning, steady, composed, his presence unchanged even as everything else had shifted. The light from the windows had moved slightly, casting longer reflections across the marble floor, and in that softened glow, the moment settled into place, no longer building, no longer uncertain, but fully revealed. And though no one had yet spoken the words directly, it was understood by everyone in the room. The truth no longer hidden behind process or perception, but standing plainly in front of them, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately, and that absence of words carried more weight now than anything he could have said before, his posture still upright, but no longer rigid, as if the structure he had relied on had quietly given way to something more human, more exposed, and his eyes dropped once more to the faint traces of ash scattered across the counter, the remnants of a decision made too quickly, too confidently. And for a brief moment, his reflection in the polished surface caught his attention again, but this time, he did not look away as fast, as though he recognized something in it that he could not ignore. The room remained still, not tense, not uncertain, but quietly aware, the kind of stillness that follows understanding rather than confusion. And behind him, the young teller lowered her gaze, not out of disinterest, but out of respect for a moment that no longer belonged to observation alone. Daniel inhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed in a way that did not need explanation, softer, steadier, but stripped of the earlier authority that had once defined it. "Mr. Reed," he said, the name landing carefully, deliberately, as if acknowledging more than identity, acknowledging position, presence, and something deeper that had been overlooked, and he paused, not searching for words, but allowing the weight of them to settle before continuing. "I should not have assumed," he added, the sentence simple, unembellished, but carrying a sincerity that could not be mistaken for routine courtesy, and though it was not a long apology, not a dramatic one, it did not need to be, because the shift in tone, in posture, in presence said more than length ever could. Marcus did not respond right away, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might simply let the words pass without acknowledgement, not out of dismissal, but out of understanding, as if he had heard versions of them before, in different places, from different people, each one arriving after the same realization. Daniel reached forward slowly, his hand moving toward the wallet still resting on the counter, and with careful precision, he lifted it, brushing aside the remaining ash with a quiet motion that felt less like cleaning and more like recognition. And he held the wallet out, not across the counter, but slightly forward, closing the distance that had once defined the interaction. Marcus accepted it, without hesitation, his fingers steady as before, the exchange simple, direct, and in that small movement, the balance between them settled into something quieter, something more even. The light from the windows had shifted again, casting a warmer tone across the lobby, softening the sharp lines of the space. And in that glow, Daniel straightened once more, but this time the movement carried a different quality, not assertion, not control, but composure rebuilt on awareness rather than assumption. "We will reissue the check immediately," he said, his tone professional again, but grounded now, free of the earlier edge. And he turned slightly toward the teller, who nodded quickly, already moving to process what needed to be done, her actions precise, respectful, as though she understood the importance of restoring not just the transaction, but the dignity that had been momentarily overlooked. Marcus watched the interaction quietly, his gaze moving from Daniel to the teller and back again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying no trace of accusation. "It is not the check," he said, the words simple, but clear, and Daniel's eyes lifted immediately, the meaning understood before it was fully explained. Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer, not challenging, not accusing, just present, and in that presence, the lesson settled more deeply than any extended explanation could have. The realization no longer confined to data or titles, but rooted in something more enduring, something that would remain long after the transaction was complete. The room remained quiet, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood. And as the teller moved to finalize the process and Daniel stood with a composure that now carried humility instead of certainty, The moment resolved itself not with noise, not with dramatic closure, but with a quiet, steady shift in awareness that lingered in the air, subtle but lasting, long after the last trace of ash had been cleared from the counter. The check was reissued quietly, the printer humming with a steady rhythm that felt almost ceremonial now, and when the teller placed it carefully into a clean envelope, her hands moved with a precision that carried more than routine. It carried awareness, the kind that lingers after something has been learned without being formally taught. Marcus Reed accepted the envelope with a small nod, his fingers closing around it without urgency, without emphasis, as though the object itself held little importance compared to what had already passed between them. And for a moment, he remained where he was, not lingering, not hesitating, simply allowing the final pieces of the moment to settle into place. Daniel Whitmore stood across from him, composed but changed, his posture no longer defined by assumption but by a quieter restraint. And though he did not speak again, there was something in the way he held his position, in the way his gaze no longer avoided Marcus, that reflected a shift deeper than words could capture. The lobby, once filled with subtle tension, now felt open again, but not the same, not untouched, as if the space itself had absorbed the moment and would carry it forward in ways no one could fully see. Marcus turned slightly, his movement unhurried, and as he stepped away from the counter, the soft echo of his footsteps on the marble floor carried through the room with a calm finality, not dramatic, not emphasized, just present, and the line of customers parted instinctively, not out of instruction, but out of recognition, their earlier glances now replaced with something quieter, something more thoughtful. Near the entrance, the security guard straightened, offering a small nod that was returned with the same calm acknowledgement, a simple exchange that held no hierarchy, only mutual awareness. The late afternoon light poured through the tall glass windows, warmer now, casting long reflections that stretched across the floor and caught the edge of the envelope in Marcus's hand as he moved toward the exit, the glow softening the sharp lines of the space, turning the polished surfaces into something almost reflective in a different way, as if the building itself were holding a mirror to what had just occurred. Daniel remained behind the counter, his hands resting lightly against the surface where the ash had once been, now cleared, but not forgotten, and his eyes followed Marcus's path only briefly before lowering again, not in avoidance, but in thought, as though the moment was continuing inside him even as it concluded outside. The young teller returned to her work, but her movements carried a new awareness, a quiet attentiveness that had not been there before, and the subtle rhythm of the bank resumed, keyboards clicking, printers humming, conversations beginning again in low tones, yet everything felt slightly altered, not disrupted, but recalibrated. Marcus reached the glass doors and paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning back, not needing to. The reflection of the interior visible in the surface before him, faint but present, and then he stepped outside into the open air, where the city continued in its steady motion, cars passing, people walking, the ordinary rhythm of life unchanged. Inside, the silence he left behind did not feel empty. It felt complete, the kind of quiet that follows understanding rather than confusion. And as the light shifted once more across the marble floor, there were no words, no final statements, only the soft, steady presence of something realized, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed, carried not in what was said, but in what was finally seen.